Wind. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Wind by Charles L. Fontenay. When you have an engine with no fuel, and fuel without an engine, and a life or death deadline to meet, you have a problem indeed. Unless you are a stubborn Dutchman, and Jan van Artevelde was the stubbornest Dutchman on Venus. Jan Willem van Artevelde claimed descent from William of Orange. He had no genealogy to prove it, but on Venus there was no one who could disprove it either. Jan Willem van Artevelde smoked a clay pipe, which only a Dutchman can do properly, because the clay bit grates on less stubborn teeth. Jan needed all his Dutch stubbornness, and a good deal of pure physical strength besides, to maneuver the roach-flat ground car across the tumbled terrain of Den Hoorn into the teeth of the howling gale that swept from the west. The huge wheels twisted and jolted against the rocks outside, and Jan bounced against his seat-belt, wrestled the steering wheel, and puffed at his pipe. The mild aroma of Herenbei tabak filled the tight ground car. There came a new swaying that was not the roughness of the terrain. Through the thick windshield, Jan saw all the ground about him buckle and heave for a second or two before it settled to rugged quiescence again. This time he was really heaved about. Jan mentioned this to the ground car radio. "That's the third time in half an hour," he commented. "This place tosses like the IJsselmeer on a rough day." "You just don't forget it isn't the Zuider Zee," retorted Heemskerk from the other end. "You sink there and you don't come up 3 times." "Don't worry," said Jan. "I'll be back on time, with a broom at the masthead." "This I shall want to see," chuckled Heemskerk. A logical reaction, considering the scarcity of brooms on Venus. 2 hours earlier, the two men had sat across the small table playing chess, with little indication that there would be anything else to occupy their time before blastoff of the stubby gravity boat. It would be their last chess game for many months, for Jan was a member of the Dutch colony at Oostpoort, in the northern hemisphere of Venus, while Heemskerk was a pilot of the G-boat from the Dutch spaceship Vanderdecken, scheduled to begin an earthward orbit in a few hours. It was near the dusk of the 485-hour Venerian day, and the twilight gale already had arisen, sweeping from the comparatively chill Venerian night side into the superheated day side. Oostpoort, established near some outcroppings that contained uranium ore, was protected from both the dawn gale and the twilight gale, for it was in a valley amidst a small range of mountains. Jan had just figured out a combination by which he hoped to cheat Heemskerk out of one of his nights, when Dekker, the burgomaster of Oostpoort, entered the spaceport ready room. "There's been an emergency radio message," said Dekker. "They've got a passenger for the Earthship over at Rathole." "Rathole?" repeated Heemskerk. "What's that? I didn't know there was another colony within 2,000 kilometers." "Well, it isn't a colony in the sense Oostpoort is," explained Dekker. "The people are the families of a bunch of laborers left behind when the colony folded several years ago. It's about 80 kilometers away, right across the Horn, but they don't have any vehicles that can navigate when the wind's up." Heemskerk pushed his short-billed cap back on his close-cropped head, leaned back in his chair, and folded his hands over his comfortable stomach. "Then the passenger will have to wait for the next ship," he pronounced. "The Vanderdecken has to blast off in 30 hours to catch Earth at the right orbital spot, and the G-boat has to blast off in 10 hours to catch the Vanderdecken." "The passenger can't wait," said Dekker. "He needs to be evacuated to Earth immediately. He's suffering from the Venus shadow." Jan whistled softly. He had seen the effects of that disease. Dekker was right. "Jan, you're the best driver in Oostpoort," said Dekker. "You will have to take a ground car to Rathole and bring the fellow back." So now Jan gripped his clay pipe between his teeth and piloted the ground car into the teeth of the twilight gale. Den Hoorn was a comparatively flat desert sweep that ran along the western side of the Oost Mountains, just over the mountain from Oostpoort. It was a thin fault area of a planet whose crust was particularly subject to earthquakes, particularly at the beginning and end of each long day when the temperatures of the surface rocks changed. On the other side of it lay Rathole, a little settlement that eked out a precarious living from the Venerian vegetation. Jan had never seen it. He had little difficulty driving up and over the mountain, for the Dutch settlers had carved a rough road through the ravines. But even the 2.5-meter wheels of the ground car had trouble amid the tumbled rocks of Den Hoorn. The wind hit the car in full strength here, and though the body of the ground car was suspended from the axles, there was constant danger of its being flipped over by a gust if not handled just right. The 3 earth shocks that had shaken Den Hoorn since he had been driving made his task no easier, but he was obviously lucky at that. Often he had to detour far from his course to skirt long, deep cracks in the surface, or steep breaks where the crust had been raised or dropped several meters by past quakes. The ground car zigzagged slowly westward. The tattered violet and indigo clouds boiled low above it, but the wind was as dry as the breadth of an oven. Despite the heavy cloud cover, the afternoon was as bright as an Earth day. The thermometer showed the outside temperature to have dropped to 40 degrees centigrade in the west wind, and it was still going down. Jan reached the edge of a crack that made further progress seem impossible. 100 meters wide, of unknown depth, it stretched out of sight in both directions. For the first time he entertained serious doubts that Den Hoorn could be crossed by land. After a moment's hesitation, he swung the ground car northward and raced along the edge of the chasm as fast as the car would negotiate the terrain. He looked anxiously at his watch. Nearly 3 hours had passed since he left Oostpoort. He had 7 hours to go, and he was still at least 16 kilometers from Rathole. His pipe was out, but he could not take his hands from the wheel to refill it. He had driven at least 8 kilometers before he realized that the crack was narrowing. At least as far again, and the 2 edges came together, but not at the same level. A sheer cliff 3 meters high now barred his passage. He drove on. Apparently it was the result of an old quake. He found a spot where rocks had tumbled down, making a steep, rough ramp up the break. He drove up it and turned back southwestward. He made it just in time. He had driven less than 300 meters when a quake, more severe than any of the others, struck. Suddenly behind him the break reversed itself, so where he had climbed up coming westward, he would now have to climb a cliff of equal height returning eastward. The ground heaved and buckled like a tempestuous sea. Rocks rolled and leaped through the air, several large ones striking the ground car with ominous force. The car staggered forward on its giant wheels like a drunken man. The quake was so violent that at one time the vehicle was hurled several meters sideways and almost overturned, and the wind smashed down on it unrelentingly. The quake lasted for several minutes, during which Jan was able to make no progress at all and struggled only to keep the ground car upright. Then, in unison, both the earthquake and wind died to absolute quiescence. Jan made use of this calm to step down on the accelerator and send the ground car speeding forward. The terrain was easier here, nearing the western edge of Den Hoorn, and he covered several kilometers before the wind struck again, cutting his speed down considerably. He judged he must be nearing Rathole. Not long thereafter he rounded an outcropping of rock, and it lay before him. A wave of nostalgia swept over him. Back at Oostpoort, the power was nuclear, but this little settlement made use of the cheapest, most obviously available power source. It was dotted with more than a dozen windmills. Windmills! Tears came to Jan's eyes. For a moment he was carried back to the flat